Yo, everybody. Before we get into the podcast itself, I want to let you know about something exciting. Off Panel launched a Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel as a way to help me pay for the show and make it better than ever. If you enjoy the show and want to support it, consider backing on there for exclusive written and audio content, early access to the podcast, and more. And now, on with this week's episode. Welcome to Off Panel. Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the woman behind the comic site, The Beat. The Comics Beat. It's Heidi MacDonald. Thanks for coming on, Heidi.
Hey, David. How's it going?
It's going great. So do you, I think the URL is Comics Beat, but you go by The Beat, right? That's what it is officially?
It is. It's Comics Beat. When I started at 14 years ago, more than 14 years ago, it was kind of a shtick where I called myself The Beat and wrote in the third person and, like The Beat knows and that kind of thing. So that kind of stuck a little bit. But yeah, then later on I had to get my own URL and Comics Beat. The Beat was taken, beat.com was taken. So I went with Comics Beat. So it's kind of the same. It's just like if you say Jack Reacher or Jack, I guess.
Yeah. I feel like people who have never run a website will never understand the exquisite pain that comes with trying to come up with a domain name that makes any sense whatsoever.
Well, let me tell you, I have a lot of them stockpiled away. And
Really?
I know yes, I do. Whenever I came up with a good word, I would go and I would snag that URL. So I am always, I'm always be prepared on that because, you're absolutely right. It is true, and this is why we have things like
Sketched?
Zuda. Yeah, Sketched and Zuda, and I mean that was a while ago. But
Yeah.
Even when Zuda came out, all the good URLs were taken. Although let me tell you, not all the good URLs are taken.
Oh, I know. They're just really expensive
yeah.
at times.
Yes. Well, you just gotta be a little imaginative, I think. So.
That's fair. Believe it or not, I didn't want to have you on this podcast to talk domain names. I wanted to have a bit of a checkup on the state of comics, and I thought you'd be a perfect person because maybe more than anybody I know, you do a good job of bridging the gap between covering the creative and commercial sides of comics. So I wanted to start with the creative side of things. Let's start with the basics. On a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being the worst comics that have ever been made or being made now, and 10, the best comics that have ever been made or being made now, what's your take on where comics are now creatively?
I think we're at a good solid 9. And, thank you very much for the kind words, by the way. So I think actually we might have been a 9.5 about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just because some people who are huge major talents were coming out with some very protean work. And I think right now, it's more like there was more mountaintops maybe 2 years ago. And now maybe we've plateaued a little bit. But we've plateaued at such a high level.
Right.
That it's really astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I just don't see how anyone can argue that we are in an absolute golden age. As the current, the People versus Craig Yoe argument shows, the reprints, just about everything is in print. Maybe it's in a crappy reprint, what you think is a crappy reprint, but pretty much everything is available right now on Amazon. From all the best of the past, as I know, looking around my apartment, it's like, all these things I dreamed of owning as a kid, from the Spirit archives to Terry and the Pirates archives to Complete Love and Rockets, everything. I'm just looking around, 20th Century Boys, everything. I don't even have room for it, So
Mm-hmm.
just the are incredible. And then when you look at new content, the sky's the limit, really.
I agree. I think generally speaking, we're at this incredibly high point, which is kind of funny because it's almost like there's so much out there that it's hard to keep track of all of the best things. It's like,
right.
You want to be reading like, let's say you're The Beat and you're trying to cover Marvel and you're trying to cover DC and stuff like that. But then there's like web comics, and then there's like people like is it Ngozi Ukazu who did the Check Please? Like trying to keep up with stuff like that, and Iron Circus Comics from C. Spike Trotman, Fantasy Sports is a comic I love by Sam Bosma. Everything by No Brow. I mean, No Brow is like a guaranteed hit in my book. If you read one of their books, you're gonna have something awesome. It's so
Right.
hard to keep track of everything that it's almost kind of like a negative in a weird way that there's just so much stuff coming out.
It is, and I would add like Breakdown Press to the list of almost everything they put out is interesting, if not great. Uncivilized, Koyama. I mean, Koyama is just like all stars. Hit after hit after hit. Certainly the old school Fantagraphics and Toronto Quarterly keep having great books coming
Mm-hmm.
out.
For a
We're
second,
talking most first, second, Top Shelf has the great book. Then the micro presses too, that are all out there. Secret Acres, Ad House. Yeah, Ad House is a great example. Okay, here's a guy who has been around for 20 years, Chris Pitzer.
mm-hmm.
He started out as did Chris Staros. When I first met Chris Staros and Chris Pitzer, both at an SPX, and Staros had a fanzine called the Staros Report. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, he got started. He did this thing. It was an annual. It was called the Staros Report, and he would do reviews of the comics that were coming out. I can't remember if he had like a star system, like 1 to 5 stars, but it's very well produced, very well written, and that's what he did. And then he suddenly got the bug. I guess he met up with Brett Warnock, and they got the bug to do this publishing company. And if you look at Top Shelf's history, I mean, they've certainly had many, many base hits, like just really good, solid books that came out. But they've also had Blankets and March, the March trilogy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these are two of the most important books of their times. Blankets by Craig Thompson came out. I guess it came out in the early aughts. I want to say like 2004. And it was really kind of the first book from a cartoonist of that generation that really found a new audience. And, it sold a lot of copies. Craig Thompson became an instant superstar. And, the story really influenced a lot of people. Of course, March, I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast. It's been one of the biggest books of the past decade, and it won a national book award. No other graphic novel has ever done that. So, we kind of reached peak comics with that. But anyway, that's just Top Shelf. I mean, I was going to say Chris Pitzer is the same. He started coming to cons because he liked comics, and then he decided to start publishing comics, and he got a very eclectic lineup of people. Books that he's put out. Now I'm totally spacing on the name of the book, but it won like a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. It was the book about the talking animals. Do you know the one I'm
I
talking?
don't. I think the first thing that comes to my mind with Ad House, I think Aphrodisiac was an Ad House book. I could be mistaken.
Yes, it was by Jim Rugg. Yes.
Yeah.
Also Pope Hats by Ethan Riley. I mean, that's a modern classic. And I'll have to Google here while we're talking, and I'll come back for the name of that book about the talking animals. But anyway, it's by Adam Hine. It got a lot of attention. So anyway, but these people, like 20 years ago, literally, they were just dreamers,
Mm-hmm.
not in the DACA sense, but it just like people who wanted to be in comics. And now 20 years later, they've made very permanent and lasting contributions to the industry as publishers. So we have all these people and more.
I think that's. I'm kind of curious if you think that a big part of the reason why you're at a 9 right now, which is, I mean, that's a hellaciously fantastic number of comics creatively. How much do you think that comes from the fact that you can be a grinder like Chris, Chris, who like does brings their dream alive and makes it a magical thing, or you can be like somebody like I said, Ngozi Ukazu, who did Check Please, who can make almost $400,000 to publish her comic. I mean, like, there's so many more opportunities. How important do you think all the breadth of opportunities that are available to creators? How important do you think that is to reaching the quality we're at right now?
Well, it's incredibly important. And, there has to be some kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for people to do things. Otherwise they become Henry Darger, or Henry Darger, who is, of course, the janitor who drew all these very disturbing paintings for his whole life. And when he died, they found this treasure trove of work. And so to prevent yourself from becoming a lonely shut-in who does their crazy work with no one having a chance of seeing it, there has to be some kind of delivery medium.
Yeah.
So the internet is definitely part of that. I think we're also at a time of peak TV. I mean, that's definitely another medium that people say has peaked right now.
Hmm.
Um, and the internet hasn't helped every medium. I mean, nobody says it's peak movie time, and
Right.
nobody says it's like peak book time or peak music time, which is kind of interesting. That uh maybe these mediums have just kind of or media, pardon me, have just kind of floated along on their usual hits and misses. But comics and television definitely seem to be speaking to the audience that we have now. And I think comics, I think because, what's important, just to backtrack, what's important about a blankets when it came out is that even in 2004, you had a real hegemony of the big two, Marvel and DC. Now, some would say you still do, but I really don't think that's true. I think there's so many other outlets that actually sell more than Marvel and DC right now. But to get an indie graphic novel that was just about a young man testing his faith with religion while he has his first giant romance, um, you know, this was not. People would have fallen down laughing, injured themselves. They fell down laughing if you said this book could be a moneymaker.
Hmm.
So so a blankets does come along and kind of redefines it. It pushes you forward. It really creates a beachhead, and then a lot of people wanted to be Craig Thompson after that. I think you can definitely see among indie cartoonists kind of a Craig Thompson-esque movement a little bit
Hmm.
among artists. And even Craig Thompson hasn't ended up being Craig Thompson. I think he had a his follow-up book was the Habibi, which like took him years to do,
Hmm.
and for Random House, he got a huge book deal for it, and it wasn't as well received. I think the reactions to that book would range from not as well received to extremely problematic and offensive. So
It's quite the spectrum.
yeah, exactly, exactly. But I mean, I wouldn't. I'm saying I don't know if you'd even call that book a success. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you determine success, of course. But I mean, it's like I don't think it's like a blankets level success, but I'm certain there's a lot of people out there who love Habibi, and there's a lot of people who hate Habibi, and either way, there's a lot of people who have read Habibi. So I feel like it's a success that a lot of people would like
Right.
to have, but maybe it's not what Craig Thompson wanted. I don't know. I mean, I was a big Space Dumplings fan,
Mhm.
although that's completely different. I think that similar to what you're talking about with Craig, I think that another book that and during that span that was huge for the way that comics have turned out is obviously it was being produced well before that, but Jeff Smith's Bone, like kind of launching
Sure.
graphics and everything, that's one of those fork in the road moments where once graphics became a real thing, and then Reina became an even bigger thing, and
Right.
like you have people like Kazuki Buishi, and you have, I mean, Craig Thompson released Space Dumplings through graphics. You have all kinds of people doing stuff through there. I mean, those are two big moments that I think kind of helped unleash comics to where they are now.
Right. And that was a very specific plan to get more kids comics out there to get it established. And I don't know. I mean, I've written about it on the beat, so it's certainly not a secret. But around that time, the same period. I mean, when you look at the period from about 2000 to about 2006, let's say,
Hmm.
maybe like the first flush of manga. I mean, a lot of the seeds were planted at this point, and a lot of the things that a lot of actions were taken that had big ramifications down the road. And I guess it's about in this period. But around this time, Kuyu Liang was hired, and Diamond established Diamond Book Distributors to be a book distribution company.
Hmm.
And this all came in the wake of another distributor that went out of business, and it actually turned out to be the best thing ever because a lot of book distributors wanted to carry graphic novels, and it became a thing of like, oh, they like us. But anyway, but Ku definitely had the idea that kids comics could be very big, and he hired Jana Morishima, who had been an editor at Scholastic, and I believe she was the first editor on Bone at Scholastic, to be. I call her, Jana Comic Seed, really, she just went out and she talked to publishers, then she talked to bookstores, then she talked to distributors, then she talked to librarians, educators. She just went around and talked for a year about why we didn't have more kids' graphic novels out there. And at the time, I said, this is the most important job there is in comics, I mean, because a lot of times to solve a problem, we all have our other things that we're doing. We don't have time to just sit down and focus on it. But Jana really was tasked with kind of
Planting those
getting a
seeds.
yeah, planting the seeds and getting a kids comics section in Barnes and Noble. I don't think that happened till long after she had left that position, but I think the seeds were planted because of that. Now, it would have happened eventually, absolutely. But she had the armament of Bone and early work by Raina, the Babysitters Club books, which were very successful also, not as successful as Smile,
Hmm.
but they were successful. So she had the weapons to go out there, or the tools, excuse me. Let's get this away from this violent metaphor. She had the tools to go out there and start building those bookcases.
Right, and in those bookcases help, like Babysitters Club, having that helped or Smile and Sisters and Drama and Ghost become as big as they were, because it was like once you were, I mean, I don't know if you've been into Barnes and Noble lately, but Barnes and Noble, their comics and graphic novel section is huge, and they have a ton of stuff in there for kids too, like in the kids section and everything. I know that because every time I have to go buy something like Amulet or a new Raina book, I have to go back there, and I'm like the 33-year-old guy who's wandering through buying a book that's for supposedly for like 10 to 16-year-olds.
Right, right, right. Yeah, no, they definitely have. The Barnes and Noble section, graphic novel section, has definitely been one of the bellwethers of the growth of the whole industry. And although the one here in New York, I just Torsten Adair, who's one of my writers, works for Barnes and Noble actually, but he just was down at the big Union Square one, which is one of the only ones left in New York, unfortunately. And he was saying how they had fewer DC comics, so that's a news tip that I need to
Mm.
investigate. Actually, yes. So, I guess the one where you are in Alaska is still well stocked with graphic novels.
Very well stocked. So is the Blockbuster, filled with all kinds of videos and DVDs and everything like that. Alaska, we're late to things
I,
disappearing.
I was gonna say, how do you have a Blockbuster?
We're one of, I think, two states that has one. So I think we have multiple as well, which is, I don't know, it's either a feather in our cap or something that's really depressing. Uh,
Wow, that's amazing.
so I want to dial back. So we talked a bit about like the publishers and everything that you're really enjoying, and comics are going well creatively. What what are the things that excite you the most in terms of like creators and comics, like in 2017? What have you really been digging on?
Well, I think there's a lot of creators who are kind of in the literary fiction mold who are really pushing forward and doing incredible work. I would definitely say Gillian Tamaki, Eleanor Davis are at the forefront of that. I just saw, I think they're having like an in conversation at SPX, so I can't wait for that. Um, also, trying to think, Vanessa Davis is also another one. There's two books that just came out. Sophia Foster Jamino, with her Sex Fantasies book, just came out from Fantagraphics, or excuse me, Koyama. And boy, of course, now I'm whiffing. I should have made this. I should have prepped for this. I was like, where is the? But I should made the list. But also creators. Such as, oh, what is the book? Sophie Goldstein. She's really big. And there are even some male, I like to call them the emerging male cartoonists who are doing some very good work. I'd say Noah Van Sciver is doing some great work. Some people I really like, although they're weird, are Connor Williamson and Connor Steckschulte. But, also Dash Shaw. Um, Another guy some people talk about is Olivier Schrauen. I mean, the guys tend to be incredibly experimental. Like all the people I just named do really experimental comics that come out from very small publishers. I think stuff that Eleanor Davis and Gillian Tamaki are doing is a little bit more accessible in a way, although it's still very it's not pat. It's not easy. None of their stuff is like four panels and a joke at the end. I love Julia Wirtz. I mean, she just had a big book come out. I've got it right here, Tenements, Towers, and Trash. It's like combines her love of comics and her love of urban exploration,
Hmm.
just urban spelunking. But I love all these people because they're just such strong voices, and they keep on creating. You know, oh, Michael DeForge. How could I forget Michael DeForge? He's really come on. I think Michael DeForge has lived up to the promise that he had when he first burst on the scene.
Hmm.
And and this is where I get a little maybe nasty, but well, not nasty, but when we're talking about Craig Thompson, it's like, Craig Thompson's had about 4 books come out. He did Blankets, Habibi. He did this little book called Carnet de Voyage that
Yeah.
was by a little kind of
The
in betweener.
travelogue.
The Travelogue, which is actually really probably his second best book as far
It's
as
very charming.
it is. I haven't actually read Space Dumplings, so I'll dial back from that. They have Space Dumplings, and um, he works on big books. He doesn't really do a lot of short stories along the way, and definitely he has a body of work. But I think I'm not counting Craig out. He might come back with an amazing piece of work or something that silences all his critics or whatever. But I think when you look, I think there's a lot of cartoonists who have emerged in the last, this century, let's say, who really have put together a solid body of work,
Hmm.
consistent body of work.
That's
And
actually one quick thing I wanted to say is like a lot of people you're talking about are also like fairly prolific. Like they
yes,
turn stuff around quite. I mean, how long was it between Blankets and Habibi? Like 7 years?
it was a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like it seems like Eleanor Davis is coming out with something like every year, and like Jillian Tamaki, it's like I almost have a hard time keeping up with what she's doing.
Well, they do a lot of web comics,
Yeah.
These are creators who have really used the web to their advantage. And I say DeForge and Van Sciver also.
Hmm.
These are people who are always working on stuff. And, I just picked up this I had wanted to mention here. I just got a copy of Now, which is the new anthology for Fantagraphics,
Hmm.
and that's edited by Eric Reynolds. I don't know if it's actually out yet. It'll be out at SPX. So yeah, I think that'll be like, a few days after this podcast goes live. And I mean, I don't actually read as many comics as I should.
Oh,
I
I'm
mean,
100% guilty of that as well.
right. I mean, I have a demanding job writing, so I need to actually carve out time to read comics. But what I got Now, I really made a point of reading it because I think the anthology usually becomes some kind of bellwether of that time in comics. And I certainly, Raw was the Raw era, and
Hmm.
um, you know, Kramer Zergit. I think you could definitely say that summed up an era. I think Mome, which kind of came out at the same time, was also like a fertile breeding ground for a certain generation of cartoonists. And I think Eric Reynolds, who works at Fantagraphics and is the editor of Now, I think he came right out and said that he was hoping to have an anthology that could stand up to that kind of legacy. And the first issue is definitely a very strong outing. I mean, the lead story is by Eleanor Davis, and
Hmm.
it's great. It's she is so consistent and so amazing and so challenging. I mean, her work is not easy at all, but she really has a vision that she carries out. And I think even if you compare, so like there's another really good story by Van Sciver in there, and who does, by the way, tend to draw on the 4 panels, 6 panels. He draws it like a lot. His stuff is so much more conventional, but I think it's still, he just has a tone and a persona that is very likable,
Hmm.
even though I know a lot of people don't like him. But
Likeable to some.
yeah, likable to some. But for me, it's like I see where he's coming from. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
Um, So, there's some really strong work by the people of this generation. And if you look back at Raw, I mean, as great as Raw is, if you were to pull off the shelf, as I could easily do here in my crowded apartment, an old issue of Raw, and you would be stunned by how great some of the majesty of the greats were. The Charles Burns, the Spiegelmans, and the um, Mark Newgarden, and all the greats that were in Raw. But there was also a lot of experimental work in there, and I
Hmm.
don't say it's not valid. That work was still great too. But I think there was a lot of I think we've really gotten away from art for art's sake
Sure.
in comic storytelling. I think it's really about literary content right now. That goes for both quote mainstream unquote, and independent literary, even art comics, that there's a certain literary content to them that is very prominent.
When you say literary content, do you mean like in terms of like a having a concrete narrative instead of being so abstract, or what do you mean by that?
I think that I mean that it's a narrative that can be quantified, you know. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I also just got this little book from Retrofit. I mean, they're a small publisher. We haven't named whose mailing list I'm on. I've just been cleaning up over the weekend, so this is such a great time because I came across so many books. And but they just put out a book by Yoichi Yokoyama, who's kind of an experimental Japanese cartoonist, and he does abstract comics. And then, you know, there's this whole school of abstract comics, and a lot of people love them because they get this kind of this thrill ride, which I'm down with. And Yokoyama's definitely probably manhandling his name, by the way. So I'm gonna sound like a total idiot. Um, a total idiot. In fact, I might Google it while I.
That's I mean honestly like I get half the names wrong, so I appreciate having somebody that's on my
Right,
wavelength.
right. Well, it's also because you see these, and then it is you know, you kind of goes in one eye and out the other, I guess you
Mm-hmm.
could say. But anyway, his stuff is very beautiful and definitely powerful in terms of just how the art is. And I think you could definitely draw some conclusions from it. I mean, definitely has a theme, let's put it that way.
Sure.
But I think a lot of Eleanor Davis's work, I mean, it's a lot of it's about uncertainty. I mean, a lot of these stories, certainly Sex Fantasy by Sophia Foster Domino, is definitely about the areas where people delude themselves,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I feel like a lot of this work is about self-delusion and identity, which obviously is a huge theme right now in general, everywhere.
Right.
And but I think just think that they grapple with identity and and you know, like how we interface with the world, for lack of a better term, on its most basic level,
Mm-hmm.
in a very direct. They grapple with that theme directly. How it's expressed is very often very indirect, but definitely bear a lot of thought.
Yeah. Well, I want to take a big shift because I want to talk about the commercials or the industry side of things now because you know you said it's a 9 out of 10 in your estimation. One thing I think one of the reasons why I think you would provide very interesting perspective on the industry side of things is you were working in the industry when the last big dark time was. It was
Mhm,
in the
yes.
90s and everything like that. And there's obviously a lot of parallels with all the variants and all the you know the gates that are being done for Marvel Legacy, for example. Not that I'm picking on Marvel yet, but I am kind of curious, like how does this time feel compared to then? Because I know some people don't really feel like it's kind of a bad time right now, but it is. Well, you talk to a retailer. A lot of retailers are very down on where things are. How does this feel compared to that time?
Well, we're definitely going through a huge paradigm shift in how the business operates right now, and you know, it's definitely it's kind of like the drought. I mean, there's a natural disaster happening in the comics industry, and we're kind of having climate change, and there is definitely going to be some survivors and some non-survivors, and I'm not really even sure who's going to come out on the other side. I'll be honest. I really do see this as the twilight of the pamphlet. You know, I've been predicting the twilight of the pamphlet for since the day I got into comics, even though I love the pamphlet. And now everybody seems to think that I'm finally right. I just have to say it enough, and finally one day I'll be right. And you know, I'm not saying it in a triumphal, this is awesome way, but I'm just saying it in an evolutionary way.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does it compare to the last big book? Well, the comics were a ton crappier 20 years ago. You know, I mean, there's just no question. You know, that was the dawn of the you know, the good girl era. You know, or the bad girls. Remember the bad
Lady
girls? You know,
Death.
like Lady Death and Vampirella and Lady Rawhide and all of these comics. And you know, every time I see people, you know, this is the thing. I mean, it's all valid, so I'm just being a cranky old coot. But when I see people talking about how awful the industry is now and why doesn't it die and yada yada yada, I'm like, wow, I wish I could plunk you down in time. I wish I could take you back to 1996 and you know, see what you think of that, Buster.
Can you imagine
Um,
Twitter during the distributor wars?
oh my God.
It would.
I
I
don't
mean,
even
it would be horrible.
Do you think it would have even happened though?
Wait, do you think like I mean, do you think that like Marvel would have bought Heroes World and all that stuff would have fallen apart like that?
Yeah.
I don't. Who knows? I mean, to be honest, like one of the big things right now is Legacy. We're going to talk about Marvel Legacy. I wouldn't think Marvel would have done Legacy, but they're doing it, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is cause and effect. I just think that a lot of things. I mean, we definitely made huge progress because of social media. But we've also made huge, you know, tragedy because of
Sure.
social media. I mean, it's like the peaks and valleys. The peaks are higher, and the valleys are a lot lower.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, 20 years ago, like I say, the comics were a lot crappier. I mean, everybody goes a little bit goes back to the primal scene of uh, Marvel buying Heroes World. And just in case any of our listeners don't know the history of it, at the time Marvel was owned by Ronald Perelman, who also owned Revlon, and he was a big high flying financier type guy. Who I don't know if it was then, but he's married to like the actress Ellen Barkin, and
Oh
he's
yeah.
like, yeah, there's all sorts of like where I live is near all the hospitals, and there's all these things named after him they gave money for, but he was leveraging the crap out of all of his companies, including Marvel, and somebody, I mean, nobody is still at Marvel who was there back in the day, so you can't say,
Tom
oh,
Brevoort. Tom Brevoort.
Brevoort was, but I would not say. I mean, Brevoort is. You're. That's right. I remember having lunch with Tom back in the '90s, back in the day, with a whole bunch of other people from Marvel, and but he is more like. I don't think he's not interested in the business side. I don't think Tom Brevoort went in to Ronald Perlman and said, "Hey, I think we should buy Heroes World." You know what I'm
Sure.
saying?
Yeah.
First off, he was an assistant editor at the time, so. But I think whoever's idea it was. And I don't know if anybody's written the book that says that. I don't know. I need to read this
Marvel
more.
Comics: The Untold Story, I think, covers it.
Does it? Okay.
Yeah.
I need to review that part of the book by Sean Howe. Really one of the essentials. That and Comic Wars. There's actually a whole book that was written about this by Dan Revive. That's another classic of the genre. But whoever went and said this, let's go buy our own distributor because Marvel had and has this cocky attitude about doing it their own way. Like, we don't need anybody else. And part of this might come from the 70s when Marvel's distributor was owned by DC and did not do very much for Marvel. Marvel was very much stymied in the 70s because of this horrible business arrangement. So, there might have been some institutional memory about that also.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, whoever came up with this cockamamie scheme, I mean, there were several distributors. When they bought Heroes World, it was a disaster. And this is why, like Netflix just bought Miller World, and everybody's like, who's going to publish the comics? Well, I've heard Image is going to publish the comics, but I don't know if that's true. But I'll tell you one thing, Netflix do not publish comics, okay?
Not
So the whole
yet.
skill set. Yeah, but also when companies that don't know what they're doing get into a business they don't know what they're doing, like Marvel buying its own distributor, the results are bad.
Yeah.
Okay, it's the classic example when Vince McMahon of the WWE decided
XFL.
to start off XFL, or he also had the Professional Bodybuilding League. He tried twice to expand his brand. Both times it didn't work because Vince knows wrestling and he doesn't know anything else. So anyway,
So compared to now.
so compared to now, there's a lot stronger infrastructure.
Right.
There's a lot stronger readership. The readership is far more broad based. Okay. Now, if you were just comparing apples to apples, I think you'd say it was amazing and it was the best time because there's certainly more women reading comics. There's certainly more kids reading comics. There's more people around the world reading comics. So you would say, oh, the readership has surged. However, because there's so much competition now from other media, it's not like you have a straight shot. So even though the potential audience is a lot larger, the media that the potential audience has access to is also a lot larger.
Yeah, at a certain point, you're actually just kind of comparing, or you're competing for time as much as anything.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, are comics going to survive this? Of course. Absolutely. Fucking-lutely. There's just no way the medium will survive. It might come out in a different form. We might lose some people along the way. We might lose some good people along the way. We might lose me. We might lose you. You know.
I hope not.
Uh, I hope not too.
Unless you mean
But
in comics, in which case I'd largely be fine. I'd prefer to stay alive, though.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I just mean just in
I know.
terms.
I'm just being
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
dramatic.
Well, you don't even have any skin in the game. You're not. You
I know.
know.
I'm just this podcaster guy who talks to people sometimes.
I know, which is amazing. Um, so the comics industry will survive, but there's a storm cloud coming, and everybody's been talking. Certainly on my site, we've been talking about Marvel sales, and Todd Allen, who writes my site, about a year ago, he was telling me how bad Marvel was, and I honestly said I didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of poo-pooing it. I was saying, oh, Marvel will always be number one. Marvel will always be number one. And he turned out to be right. I mean, they just couldn't shock the body back into life. And Legacy is a very poor attempt at resuscitating a corpse.
Yeah, I mean that the interesting thing about it is like they've always had an escape hatch. They've always had like the rebirth play. But
Hmm.
the thing is like you said earlier, it's like they've always kind of I mean like I think a good way to look at Marvel throughout their life is as much as I love Marvel. I love Marvel in a lot of ways, but they are arrogant.
Hmm.
And they always
Right.
kind of feel like they know what the right move is. And the thing is like there is I mean I can't imagine anybody really thought that Legacy would be that the move. And I can't like to me it seems very odd because the playbook was there with Rebirth. I mean I think Rebirth did have they're still number 2 behind Marvel, but I think that DC is in a much healthier place than they were, not only in the sense that I think that their sales are much more sustainable than they were before, but they also I don't know how you feel about what DC's been doing lately, but I feel like they've been oddly wise given the fact that they changed basically nobody at the top.
Right. Well, uh, DC has had a huge. I mean, they might as well be a new company because they moved
Right.
coasts, and they have a whole new. I mean, they do have a lot of new executives running the place, and there's been a lot of fallout. If you look at the masthead between now and when they first moved, there's a lot of EVPs, SVPs, VPs who, uh, there's been some attrition there. Let's put it that way. So, so it's a pretty tight group at this point,
Mm-hmm.
an experienced group, and I mean, you have two things going for you at DC. One is Wonder Woman. I mean, I can't tell you what a big boost that was. When I went to Comic Con this year, like the last 2 years, because the move and everything, I would say morale was very bad at DC, and it was very easy to tell. You could just see people were a little down in the dumps, and the books kind of suffered. And then, to props to Jeff Johns, they did this whole rebirth thing. We're optimistic. Also, everybody got settled in with their new life in California and realized it was fine, you know. And now you have Wonder Woman, which is a big kind of out of left field hit, and Diane Nelson looks like a genius. DC
Mm-hmm.
Superhero Girls is so hot.
Mm-hmm.
It's only at Warner Brothers. That is like the gem of the crown.
My niece loves it so much, so much, and it's funny because like I don't think that I mean, let's not. She didn't really care about the other superheroes, but she like dresses up as Batgirl, and she like we sent her the comics, and she loves them, and she loves everything about them. It is kind of an amazing hit.
It is, and I visited a friend of mine who has a little girl who's like 4 or 5 years old, and she has everything DC Superhero Girls,
Mm-hmm.
everything, you know. So this is like a genius move. So anyway, so and then you could counter this and say, well, Marvel has the movies, and that's true. MCU is kind of the biggest thing going right now. However, they had to disavow. They had to distance. Marvel Cinematic Universe had to distance itself from Marvel Publishing, and
Yeah,
Marvel
they're
Publishing
separate companies.
they're separate. They got left in the dust, with crap like Inhumans. Good God.
Ugh. I didn't watch it. I didn't watch it, but I imagine it is not good.
Well, I haven't seen it either, but the parts I've seen, as Tamara Dar, one of our writers, pointed out that there was a story today about in the trades about how badly it had done. Like they released Inhumans to the IMAX theater, which is a big conceit of, a lot of this goes back to Ike Perlmutter. I don't know how much we want to bag on him, but he's the chairman of Marvel. So, and the Inhumans is his dream. So,
The replacement X-Men.
the replacement X-Men. So they put it on IMAX. It did worse than the release of re-release of a 40-year-old movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Wow.
And then the story said that the budget was so low. Now Ike is a legendary penny pincher. Okay, so they have had a very tight budget, and that was one of the reasons that Kevin Feige always fought with Ike, was over the budget for the
Mm-hmm.
Marvel movies. So Inhumans is produced under a Perlmutter level budget. So basically, they ran out of money for Medusa's hair,
Oh no.
the CGI. So they had her hair
Oh,
cut off. They shaved her head in the last episode.
no way. That is unbelievable.
Way,
Oh my God. That's
way.
terrible. Well, yeah, I mean, but I want to go back to DC for a second because one thing I wanted to point out is like, Superhero Girls is huge, Wonder Woman is huge, but I also like some of the publishing decisions they're making is very fascinating to me because it's like, Vertigo. I mean, you say what you want about Vertigo, but Young Animal has been I don't know, it's not a big commercial hit, but it has been a very interesting creative endeavor.
Right,
The Hanna-Barbera stuff has been
right.
stunningly like challenging and impressive for a Hanna-Barbera license. And then beyond that, I mean, like some of the stuff that they've been talking about doing, like the focus on prestige style books and like doing kind of throwbacks to like not throwbacks, but like books in the style of their backlist, like The Killing Joke and Long Halloween and Watchmen and et cetera, et cetera. Like this theoretical line that they could do using top writers and top artists to create books that can, form a new level of their backlist is like really smart because that's always one been the secret strengths of DC is their backlist. They dominate in the book market because of that. And I don't know. I mean, it's to me, it's been very strange because Jim Lee and Dan DiDio are still at the top. And yet it's like they have, maybe it's that Los Angeles sun, but they seem like they have completely different perspectives.
Absolutely. And it's the worst kept secret in comics that DC is going to launch these new lines, next year. I don't know if they're announcing them at New York Comic Con, but yeah, I mean, Jim Lee has said, "Oh yeah, we're soft announcing this." It's like they don't really want to announce it, but they want people to know they're doing it. So it's like the most. It's not even a leak. It's like I don't even know what to call it. But anyway, they're doing these lines. You're absolutely right. It's really forward looking, and um I do think it's just a change of perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you look at Jim Lee's history, even as a publisher at Wildstorm, I mean, obviously he tried some different things, and they might have been uh, what it was at the time might have been very much in line with what a quote superhero unquote publisher would put out. But obviously he's been thinking about this stuff for more than 20 years. So, and I think that they just, they brought back some really great people, like Marie Javins.
Mm-hmm.
She's the one who does the Hanna-Barbera line, and she's always been a really excellent editor. Like her stuff at Marvel, she did the 2099 line back in the 90s, with like Warren Ellis and
Mm-hmm.
some other really great people that she kind of nurtured to their first big successes. And so she's really one of the unsung heroes of comics. And I hope she's got a really strong position at DC right now, which is real. It's nice that some of Marie's talent is recognized for it.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally agree. DC is definitely trying some things and just made some smart moves. And yeah, listen, but a lot of it is just perception as well. I mean, you probably know this, is that the whole Young Animal line, which was quote headed up unquote by Gerard Way, was originally supposed to be part of Vertigo, or at least planned to be under Shelley Bond.
Mm-hmm.
And had those books been announced from Shelley Bond, no one would have cared.
Right.
I mean, it's really sad. It's just like that story about the women running the website and they brought in their own Remington Steele. I mean, Gerard Way was his own Remington Steele. But at the same time, it's like sometimes you gotta just, give the place a freshen up the decor a little bit. So that worked. Now I think Todd and I were talking about this a little bit today, and if you look at DC's absolute numbers, they're really not that great either.
No. No.
But they certainly have the impression of actually listening to people, whereas Marvel is in a bunker right now, and the bunker seems to be getting more and more depressed. And I mean, I've heard that people at DC, when they have their big meetings, they sit and they worry about Marvel.
Oh, of course. Well, I mean, the thing is like Marvel has the I think DC in actuality are in a much healthier position in terms of what they're producing and the sustainability of everything like that. But Marvel has just always been better at gaming the system than they have been. I mean,
Yeah.
like you say what you will about Marvel Legacy and the gates that they have for those lenticular covers, but Dennis Barker is going to order 1,000 copies of Marvel Legacy. You're going to have Midtown Comics ordering a ton of copies of all those books, and it's going to
Yes.
work. And they're going to be number one, and they're going to be number one by even more than they were in August. And it's the thing is like they're really good at playing the game, and DC has been. I think DC is looking for ways to be a little bit more sustainable with what they're doing, and it's a difference in approach. I do think it's really fascinating though that DC has kind of leaned into what you're talking about with like I I'm not on the death of the pamphlet team. For listeners, the pamphlet being like the actual monthly comic format. I do think it's going to be a lot more diverse, and it's comics, the actual pamphlet comics, I think will continue on. It's just maybe not as dominant as it has been in the past.
Right. Well, I didn't say death.
Oh,
I said
okay,
the
my bad.
Twilight. I said the Twilight.
Okay.
Goddardammer pamphlet. So,
Yeah, but I mean, I do think that DC, like the way that's the thing that's like I said, it surprised me about Legacy is like DC at least focused on the books that they know work and then double ship those. Meanwhile, like I mean, Marvel's publishing like Spirits of Vengeance and Marvel 2-in-1 and all these different things that probably won't do that much. And it's I don't know, it's fascinating. It's an odd place because both the business decision and the creative decisions seem to me to be kind of non-starters for a lot of people. I mean, like I talked to Brian Hibbs about this. Brian Hibbs wrote about it on your site about this. Nothing really is changing in Marvel Legacy. Largely, the
no.
books are the same books as they were before. So how will that actually lead to sustained change?
Well, I'm sure you've heard like the big rumor about Legacy is that really it's just setting up another reboot next year, right?
Yes, 100%.
Oh, yes. So, I see nothing to disabuse me of, believing that rumor. Because if this is really their big shot, it's the lamest thing I've ever seen. Guess what? They're going back to the legacy numbering. Well, maybe you can go back to a new number one after you hit these numbers that they've stretched all credulity to get to, you know? So, um, I Marvel knows that you're absolutely right. They're going to game the system, and this the aftermarket on these lenticular covers is going to be ridiculous. It's just
Yeah.
going to be sickening. But the tulip market crashed. We live in a very uncertain world, and I'm sure again the people that you talk to must be like the ones I talk to. Everybody's really scared about what's going on in the world in general.
Yeah.
And I've even heard it said that, Kickstarter was like, don't launch product, during this time period or because Donald Trump might do something that sucks all the air out of the wind. And I mean, it's really true. You can even see on the beats traffic, when something horrible is happening in the world, the traffic dies down a bit because
Mm-hmm.
people just don't have any time. I mean, people are just transfixed by this horrible disaster unfolding in front of them, like a car crash and or this wonderful thing happening depending on your point of view but so I anything could really happen. I mean like is DC going to be the dutiful grasshopper or the dutiful ant who just keeps storing away those nuts for the winter?
I don't know.
Yeah, and then Marvel's certainly, not a grasshopper, but they're the hare. And yeah, I mean I just don't know if the secondary market for I mean so okay, so let's spitball here, David. Okay, so let's say what happens is the orders on these lenticular covers are huge, as they
Mm-hmm.
will be. And then the secondary market for them has to be huge as well. So, like, people are selling them on eBay for hundreds of dollars. Okay, now is the money from that going to be enough to buoy a whatever Dennis Barger store is called now? I mean, is this money really going to solidify the industry?
No, I mean it's certainly not sustainable. I mean, like a good example was I talked to a bunch of retailers about Do you remember when they launched that Dark Knight 3, The Master Race, and they had like the 1 in
Yes.
5,000 Jim Lee variant cover? And I talked to a bunch of retailers about it, and it's like Dennis Barger was more than happy to do a book like that because he can sell that for enough money that he'll barely have to sell that many of the
Right.
5,000 he ordered.
Sure.
But I mean, it's like I talked to this other retailer who he figured they had to sell half of the books, half of the 5,000 to be able to make it worth his while, and he was nowhere near that number. And it's just like that stuff is just not. I mean, it's not something that's going to lead to sustained success, and it is really fascinating seeing all the different shops that have kind of bailed on it. And it's I still think that largely because most of the accounts that are not doing it outside of some of them like Jesse James Comics or like Jetpack, their orders are big enough that Marvel's going to feel it. But at the same time, I think like Barger and like Midtown and everybody like that are going to be so big that it's not even going to really matter that much.
Well, I mean, that's how they said it. They game the system. They set it up that way. They made the minimums that you had to order to get the lenticular so high that they couldn't help but, they didn't need everybody to go in on it,
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Right.
But at the same time, this is what I think. I think that we will see, one thing that's going on right now is Marvel's having this digital sale, this Labor Day digital sale,
Right.
and which is very odd. And Disney's fiscal year ends in September 30th, begins October 1st. So, but now the lenticulars don't come out until next
October.
month. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if which side of the ledger that will be because the orders are placed this month, so I'm not sure. But traditionally at Marvel, when you see shortfalls in revenue, you see people let go because they run a very, very narrow margin.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they're very cheap. And so I would expect to see another big name let go for Marvel in the wake of Legacy if the issue twos or the issue 652 don't do as well as one might hope. So, and then where will we be? I mean, there's like basically they're like the spaceship that's just throwing everything off in order to reach Earth, escape Earth's gravity or the moon's gravity.
Mm-hmm.
Or Mars gravity, wherever you are. So they keep lightening the load, lightening the load, lightening the load. And eventually there's not going to be any load to lighten. And, we keep thinking, have we reached it now? I don't know. I mean, we have this next reboot to go.
Yeah. The funny thing though is like you can always just keep saying there's always the next one. And it's like at a certain point, it's like I don't know. I don't know if they can reach a point where like the direct market and others won't trust them, or that their other revenue streams won't make it worthwhile. Like personally, I'm a huge Marvel Unlimited user, and I don't know what that kind of revenue does for them because it's only like $9.99 a month or whatever it is. But at the same time, that's an additive cherry on top of the single issue market, and then they have the book market, and then they have the trade sales, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like I don't know if they can keep sustaining off of that, but maybe they can.
Well, I think we're going to see one of two things happen. Okay. I think now that we're talking, because I asked you before, but really all it would take for Marvel to win everybody back is just to do what DC did with DCU. If you remember that misguided relaunch. Well, I think if they put some new people on the books that were more like, Twitter favorites or Tumblr favorites, I think everybody would react favorably to it, don't you?
No, well, I mean, the problem with DCU wasn't so much that they had people that weren't like, I mean, like, take a good example is Prez. Like, I love that book, Mark Russell and Ben Caldwell. But at the same time, it's like that. I mean, the reason why DCU was a failure was because it wasn't what people really like. The people who actually spend money on comics want, and by the people who actually spend money on comics, I mean comic shops. Like they're not going to look at a Prez or like I don't remember what other books were in there. These weren't part of it, but I mean, like a good example is like Green Team or The Movement or something like that. Those books were those were DOA. People just don't care, and the reason why DC refocused on Rebirth on the main ones was because those are the ones that they know that they can move. I think one of the biggest problems Marvel has right now is their line is just too big.
Oh, absolutely, yes. But this comes with the need to hit that number.
Yeah.
I mean, and they really do need to hit that number. I mean, I've heard this from multiple sources that if they don't hit that number, then bad things happen. Just return to DCU. I think one of the things that was really interesting about that is that I think the reason it failed is the other side. I don't think that anybody's heart was in it at DC. They came out during the move.
Mm,
You'll recall that it had that stupid, end point or whatever it was called,
convergence.
a convergence, that was supposed to be done while they moved,
Right.
So this was really, at that point, it was sort of like, I think it was people who are really just depressed,
Yeah.
saying, all right, you know what, you said you wanted this, let's just do it. And there was a lot of excitement at first for DCU because it did seem like it was modern and moving forward. And guess what? A lot of people did stay on. Not a lot. I mean, some people did graduate from DCU to Rebirth, and I think it did signal a new wave at DC that they were willing to try. A lot of new people who were not, hadn't been doing DC Comics for 50 years. So DC, Marvel at the same time, as much as we're criticizing them, my heart goes out to them because they wake up every day and go on Twitter
Oh God, it's
or
horrible.
message boards, but they not only see all of comics activists and progressives, dinging them for every single thing they do. They see, comics gamer gators
Right.
also. Like on the beat, it's like nobody criticizes Marvel for not being progressive enough. It's just like, oh, why are they publishing this SJW shit?
Yeah.
I mean, every day I'm deleting comments like that. So I think the pushback, from the deplorables of comics against Marvel is even stronger. I mean, listen, David, I can't say that if I were in their position, I wouldn't do the same thing. I
Yeah.
wouldn't just bunker down and not listen to anyone.
I honestly like that's one of the underrated things about all of this is they're in a ultimate damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Absolutely.
And it does suck. It's easy for me to sit here and say they should have made different moves, but the problem is like they've been throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, but the problem is like they get so much like dislike from both sides. I mean, hate would probably be more an accurate term from both sides. That it's just like it's hard to decide what works because it's like they can't please. Seemingly, it's more that they can't please anybody more than they can only please one side. I'm gonna ask you one last question about this. Then we got to move on to the comics journalism stuff. This got to be a quick one. It's tough. It's gonna be the hardest question I ask. Who has had a tougher year, Marvel or the Mets?
Oh, the Mets. I don't know. I'm watching them while we're talking here. It's a horrible game where DeGrom, the Mets have had a soul sucking. I mean, Marvel can bounce back. I mean, the Mets will eventually.
Hey, at least
You know, okay,
I mean,
yeah,
if
yeah.
Syndergaard
Go.
pitched, you guys would be in a lot better
Oh
shape
well, that's a whole different thing.
instead of Kevin Pilecki or Plawecki.
Yeah, yeah, Plawecki. I want to throw one thing in real quick before we move on from Marvel, and I really do think that the Gamergators comics are never going to win over because they were just bad people, and
They're
um
dinosaurs.
yeah, they're done. Well, they're not even that. They're just trolls. They're trolls.
Sure.
But I do think comics activists who are dinging on Marvel, I think they're unfair to a lot of creators. Marvel. There was so much outcry when Nightwing, which was written by David F. Walker, got canceled. I mean, think piece after think piece
Nighthawk.
was.
Wait, Nighthawk?
Yeah,
Nighthawk.
Nighthawk. Yes, pardon me, Nighthawk. And then he has a new book come out called Occupy Avengers, and have I seen one word about that? Zero. Zip. Oh, maybe it's a terrible book. I don't know. But here's a creator who has he's a minority. He has struggled in comics for a long time to be taken seriously by idiots. And finally, Marvel is really giving him a lot of work. It's like, they did the same thing with Black Bolt. Maybe you don't like the Inhumans, but they hired Saladin Ahmed, a really good science fiction writer, to write this book. And, pay a little attention to some of the voices that Marvel is fostering. I would like to see a little bit more of that.
I agree. It is a fascinating thing. I mean, that actually transitions well into the comics journalism angle because I've talked to a lot of people. Like Cy Spurrier wrote something that was really great about this, and it was talking about how difficult it is to get people to pay attention to your book past like. Well, I mean, I'm going to paraphrase, but he was talking about basically past number one. But one of the fascinating things to me is how difficult it is to get people to pay attention past number one, or when people perceive there's like an injustice put upon your book. Like remember when Omega Man got canceled?
Yep.
When Omega Man was canceled, more people wrote about it than when it actually ended by like the power of infinity. And it's
Yep.
just, it was like people couldn't care less when the book actually ended seemingly, but they cared so much when it was perceived to be ending early. And that's a aside, but I did want to ask, in a general sense, how do you feel about where the world of comics journalism is now? Like, let's do that 1 to 10 scale again, with one being the worst stretch ever, 10 being the best ever.
Boy, this is a hard one. If you'd asked me maybe last week, I probably would have said 4, but maybe this week I'll say 5
Sure.
because I was actually like, I put out a call for reviewers, actually for my other job at Publishers Weekly, and I've been going through the responses I got. There's actually a lot of really great writers about comics out there, but they're all writing for their own little sites that don't get any attention,
Mm-hmm.
and um, it's very I don't. It's hard to say. There's definitely more passionate voices writing about comics than ever, and don't see. I don't see journalism that is advocacy journalism about comics unless it's negative. I mean, when something bad happens, everybody's going to come out with a hot take, a searing hot take that redefines the transgression. I mean, if
Right.
you look at all the stuff that was written about divided states of hysteria, um, eh, there was some very powerful stuff written about that by this Howard Chaykin's book. And you do not see that level of advocacy in a positive way.
Yes, I agree entirely.
And even to go back to the blankets era, okay? I mean, we had a lot of internet then, but we didn't have social media. But, there was a lot of positive online chatter about blankets. There was a lot of positive, a book that really generated a lot of positive online chatter was Scott Pilgrim. And, this
Mm-hmm.
goes back to the legendary Warren Ellis forum.
Yes.
So, which I'm sure we talked about last time I was on your show. And were you on there or did that predate
No,
you?
that was before. I mean, I was reading comics, but it was like pre me on the internet, really. So no. Long story
Okay.
short, no.
Okay. Well, this was a forum that I guess was at the turn of the century and led by Warren Ellis. And I mean, so many creators were on there. Brian Lee
Fractions,
O'Malley.
Zdarsky.
Well,
Uh,
Fractions, Darsky, that whole Kelly Sue.
yep.
They all came from the Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey. That whole image generation comes from the Warren Ellis Forum, and we're directly nurtured by him. But also Brian Lee O'Malley, Carlos Speed McNeil, Alex DeCampi. She's another one who's on
Mm-hmm.
there. I mean, the list just again. I should look around the room and see who else was on there.
I mean, speaking of comics journalism, Fraction launched Savant from that, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah, I did. And there was this site called Art Bomb that had a lot of the writers. But you really saw, buzz. You saw good buzz,
Mm-hmm.
and for things like, I mean, Scott Pilgrim is specifically a book that a lot of retailers at the time did not want to carry. There was a lot of pushback against Scott Pilgrim, but there was also a lot of very vocal people saying this was a really important book. And of course, by the time the 6th book came out, it was a phenomenon, and it still kind of remains, I guess, a bellwether of aughts culture. I'd be very curious. One of my friends was telling me that's all about the Audis now, so it'll be interesting.
Audie's nostalgia.
Yeah,
Oh my god.
yeah, we're already done with the '90s, and now the cutting edge is the Audis. So we'll be seeing. I'd be very curious to see how Scott Pilgrim, comes out in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in that. So I mean, it seems like we're cycling pretty quickly.
It really does. God, we're gonna run out of things to be nostalgic about.
Yeah, but that's the thing that I miss in comics journalism, and partly it's just a function of there's so much of it. I mean, even though I'm saying, it's a 4, I mean that sounds like I'm really dinging my competitors. There's some good writing being done at sites like Comics Bulletin and Multiversity, and certainly mainstream stuff like Paste. I mean, I know the AV Club just got Kinjified, so that's kind of bad. But
Wait, what
there's
does
a lot of
Kinjified mean?
Kinja, like I didn't realize the AV Club was owned by the same company that purchased what was left of Gawker. So they use this platform called Kinja, so they put everything on Kinja. And
Oh, is that why their articles look weird?
yeah, they
Oh.
this new commenting system and yada yada. But and this is really, I mean, this really speaks to where we're at as a culture right now. Even in the larger sense. And I just sound like the oldest person. I
No,
say
you
this.
don't.
But there's like the one problem with having a plurality of voices, which is what social media does, is that sometimes you do need a leader.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to be, a colonialist or a fascist or whatever, but the reason we have leaders is so that you have someone who is just like, Jana Comic Seed. Like this person is tasked with thinking about all these things that you don't have time to think about.
Hmm.
And the leader does the things, and for hopefully it's a good leader. A good leader does all the things that you don't have time to think about because you are busy just getting your kids off to school. So you don't have time to think about whether there's harmful PVCs in their water bottle
Hmm.
necessarily. So anyway, and as far as like we don't see, like, there is no critic who could come out tomorrow and say, I love this book, and then everyone would be talking about it.
So are you like, yeah? I mean, I think that I don't know. I'd like to think that there is, but maybe there isn't. The problem is I think that there's two major issues right now with the comics journalism world. One is that the dogs at the top are kind of sleeping at the wheel at best. Otherwise, they've just kind of lost their way. And the other thing is like you were talking about with like there's so many small sites. I honestly think that what that side of the world needs more than almost anything is consolidation
Right.
into like a larger site. Like because I wasn't like a I was not an evangelist or super fanboy of Comics Alliance, but I appreciated what Comics Alliance did, and I appreciated their place. And without them, we're kind of left with not a lot going on at the top.
Mhm.
And in terms of like kind of progressive voices that do a little bit something more in terms of their writing, and I do think it's really interesting where you see like Comics Alliance closed. It doesn't feel like it was this year because it feels like it was 40 years ago, but it was
I
like
know, right?
February.
It was just February.
Yeah, I mean CBR has completely changed everything about itself. And you have like groups like Panel by Panel and Comics Mint going with like a more subscription or pay by the issue type model. I do think it's interesting seeing how everything is kind of changing. It's like everyone's kind of trying to figure out how they can make it work, and sometimes that means closing, and sometimes that means completely kind of losing who you were in the process. And other ones, it's like both of those ones I mentioned have a paywall. How do you
Hmm.
think that the comics journalism and criticism worlds will evolve as the internet and the way it's monetized changes? Do you think the era of like a comic centric site that could be created today is dead?
Well, I hope not. I definitely hope not. And there's always something that can, um, people still like content. Okay. I mean, I see this at the beat, and I'm sure you see it on your own site. When we talked about this, I mean, I forget what was it, a couple years ago that I was a guest before,
Yeah,
and
2015. Yeah.
right. Wow. Amazing. But I remember when Sketched came out, like really, you came out of nowhere, and yet you just started putting up really solid content, and the response was immediate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot's happened in 2 years. I don't even know if you could put that up now, and you'd get the same response to it. But I do think that people still they like information. They like things that they're not getting everywhere, and um, so obviously it's hard to do that where reviews are concerned, because there are reviews everywhere. But we're trying to, here's a little scoop for you. We are trying to ramp up the review section at the beat. And I do feel this is an area where the beat could definitely improve, and where we could definitely have something that is more worthwhile, or of more value. And of course, a lot of sites run reviews. So, I'm not under any notion that just because the beat starts running reviews, that it's going to magically suddenly become, the New York Review of Books for comics. But it is something that we're trying to do, and it's I don't know what it Jog quit. Joe McCullough quit at the Comics Journal.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta be honest, I could never finish one of his columns. Now, is that I know everybody else loved him. I know everyone loved him, and he is, from all different sides of the spectrum. Jog was loved and um, Hazard and cherished. and a lot of people are very sad. And I mean, I certainly know he's a good writer and he loves comics. And I mean, I know I see those things definitely. And yet I also, if you look at the Craig Yoe thing that's going on right now, the Comics Journal, and let's face it, the Comics Journal has been the number one outlet for serious comics criticism. I mean, it certainly was the 70s and the 80s, the 90s, not, I mean, it it definitely isn't anymore, but because it had that legacy, it still has a little bit of cachet. It's
Mm-hmm.
like the ruined castles of the Home and Rolley Empire or something. But if you, and it, the Craig Yoe thing is really like the last gasp of that whole world, because you see in the comments, you see current comics people don't give a shit about elitism and about these beautiful editions, with Scarlet. I mean, if you hold up a Craig Yoe book and then you hold up uh, I just got one here, like the Fantagraphics Carl Barks Library, I mean, probably I see more people talking about Craig Yoe than they do Carl Barks.
Right.
I really do. I see more people enjoying those books for whatever reason. And I mean, listen, I wrote an introduction for one of Craig's books and we're friends. So, if he hears this, he's probably going to unfriend me. But but it's like, one of the sins that he was mentioned was um uh the like Spiegelman, Toon Books put out that Tiny Toons collection, which is, to be fair, one of the most beautiful books. It's like an anthology of kids' books. It's absolutely stellar, And then supposedly Craig Yoe stole the idea, and he did. He put out a book of. I mean, I didn't know the backstory, but I knew around the same time he put out his own book that seemed awfully similar. It was like a Christmas treasury or something. The For that Toon Books one, the editors spent a year on an email chain deciding what would go into that book,
Mm-hmm.
and still decided to put zero female cartoonists into it. And then, um,
This is what you were tweeting about the other day, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And Craig Yoe probably just went out of his own knowledge and just picked some stories and put them in a book. And if you put them both down in front of a reader, who will know the difference?
Yeah, it was kind of a fascinating story to pop up. I mean, for listeners that don't know, largely it's basically like TCJ ran like a. I don't know what the best word for it would be, but basically they hate Craig Yoe's books, right?
And this is a long-term thing. I mean, I've known this. Everybody's known it for a long time. This is no secret. It was just they decided to put it down on paper
Right,
or on.
exactly. But I mean, largely, I hate to be that guy, but it's like largely like most people don't care about that. And is that a horrible thing to say? I don't know. But I mean, the thing is like it is a fascinating topic because it's something that really only who would cover that? Maybe you, TCJ, maybe Tom Spurgeon.
Well, yeah. I mean, they all had like comments on it. Tom had a little paragraph about it. I've been working on my thing. I didn't have a chance today, but I have a piece coming out tomorrow about it. Yeah, but I think this goes to the higher criticism. In the very first issue of the Comics Journal, that was magazine format back in 1976 or 7 or whatever it was. There was, because I had all the back issues and I devoured them. There was a piece by Paul Levitz, who got his start in fanzines, called "A Call for Higher Criticism," where he basically goes in and wants to have it's so prescient because now he's a teacher and he teaches exactly this. But it's more like, where did this come from and what are the antecedents and how does this relate to the school of art and the school of writing? And, he wanted to do this kind of very dry literary analysis of comics 40 years ago when, the stuff we had to go on was a lot less deep than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just torn. I mean, I just asked a little couple minutes ago, like, is there a critic? No. Could there be a Twitter conversation
Yeah.
that people saw? Absolutely, and I'm sure it happens every day. But if you're not online at the right moment, you're gonna miss it. You
Yeah,
know?
that's how I found out about the Craig Yoe article. Was I think it was Ben Towell was tweeting about it, and then next thing you know, I was on the article. But it is just really fascinating. I do think that that's one of the interesting things with the comics journalism world these days is how intense the focus is in a lot of the
Right.
stuff. Like obviously, I like a lot of my stuff was like massive articles about the business of comics, but like it does seem like there's a lot more analysis of business stuff than than I ever remember before that. And then you have like, something like Panel by Panel, which is by Hassan Otsman El How, which I really like. And it like half the issue is just focused on one comic and how it all came together and things like that. And it's interesting how like precise, like how in depth these like art, a lot of the art sites and a lot of everybody else is getting into about these very nichey subjects. And I don't know. I mean, it is kind of interesting. It's like it kind of makes it hard to succeed because the focus is so narrow. But at the same time, it's like I think that's where a lot of the avenues for content is getting a more laser focus on things. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting more nichified in all things. Conventions are getting more nichified, and obviously journalism is getting more nichified. I mean, I do think, I'm torn between. I mean, I see so many of today's most fervent, comics Twitter advocates writing stuff, and that if you go back to the story beyond like, the last 10 years is blatantly wrong. Okay.
Wait,
But
as far as what?
they're just factually, or like they don't know what happened 11 years ago.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Now, does that matter? Yes and no. I mean, for me as a journalist, the whole reason I'm not even a journalist, the whole reason I write the kind of stuff I do is I like to know the reasons for things.
Yes.
I like to know why this happened, and I like to know the hidden reasons why this happened. And there's always hidden connections that you find that explain things a lot more clearly. And so for me, what happened 11 years ago is just as important as what happened yesterday, because it probably explains what happened yesterday. But at the same time, some new shit is going to happen that comes from completely new. And, I mean, that's the thing that people really will be talking about. So, yeah.
I do think it's fascinating how cyclical all this stuff is, though, because it's like it seems like we're always kind of having similar conversations. I mean, you're talking about Paul Levitt's wanting a call for higher criticism, and it's 40 years ago, and I feel like every day on Twitter people are talking about how they wish there was better criticism online, and I'm just like, I don't know. It's like Battlestar Galactica. All this has happened before. All this will happen again. I mean, it just kind of is. It's very cyclical and all that, but it is odd. I want to close out with a couple questions about like the financial stuff in the world. I had a listener question that was asking about AdSense in the past. You know how you had all those problems? I don't know what's going on with that. I don't even think AdSense is really a thing anymore.
Yeah.
How is the beat going? I know you have a Patreon going. Is the world of running a website largely on your own? Is that something that's still working just fine, or how is the world?
Well, I will say that the day Comics Alliance folded was a great day for the beat, just because
consolidated audience.
But I mean the day CBR changed and all the things that consolidated. I'm sure you saw it. I wrote that big article back in January that was about, or actually maybe it came out in March, but I did it. Where I counted the number of stories that the sites did.
Oh yeah.
And how many actually about comics, and like as for people who want to advertise on a site that's about comics, they have very few options, and the beat is one of the better options. So for me, actually, the consolidation has been great. I mean, advertising is way up this year, and some other things are happening just that will probably allow me to expand more, I hope. But I'm always working on these deals. But AdSense, I mean, that happened years ago. Now, unless you're in an ad exchange, doesn't even matter.
Right.
I mean, I never even went back and dealt with Google on that. I mean, it happened 3 or 4 years ago. And,
I know.
But I mean, I had a whole to-do list to get back in Google. Maybe I'll do it again someday. It's good to be in Google's good graces, I guess. So.
They're so not fun to work with, though. They're like, it's definitely my way or the highway, understandably, because they have all the power. But still, they're so crazy to work with.
Yeah.
I am kind of, it has been really interesting seeing how like the models for how you can pay for things has been working. Cause like you have a Patreon, I have a Patreon, You have Comics Mint who's doing it entirely through Patreon. You have Panel by Panel who's doing it through Gumroad, and they're like, you pay $2.50 for an issue. I mean, it is really interesting seeing how people are kind of adapting to the way that things are now, because it's so hard to monetize. I mean, you look at all the, I mean, like the era of the banner ad is largely dead in terms of an actual way to pay for things. And so you're having to find alternatives. And it's been really interesting to see how things have changed.
Right. Well, I have a lot. Listen, I have a lot of banner ads. I'm still doing it by the same model I did when I started 14 years ago. I'm very fortunate that I'm able to do that. Um, I have a successful Patreon, could be more successful, but, I have it. And, uh, I mean, I'm super lucky. I mean, I don't know why I survived doing this while other people haven't. And believe me, there's been ramen involved, which for a woman of my years is hard, but I won't give up. I just won't give up. and and like we do have all these models, and this goes back to the bigger picture. I mean, comics journalism is about the most worthless thing there is. Well, I mean, it's true, because
Yeah.
if it weren't worthless, people would be making money at it.
Well, but like that's, I mean, you could say that about anything. Look at Vice. Vice closed Vice Sports, and they had some of the best writers in sports about that. And like that's because they couldn't make money off of it. And you
Hmm.
have look at Fox Sports. I mean, I don't know if you paid attention to that insanity, but they pivoted to video and like like the whole thing about how they were going to change the way that they wrote, and all of the writers were going to write as voice boxes for people like Colin Coward or like whomever, Jason Whitlock, Skip Bayless, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's just like it's insane. I mean, like sports is, I mean, baseball, football, basketball, these are massive billions and billion
Yes.
dollar industries, and they're having the same problems.
Hmm. Well, but look at it. Look at everybody's a pundit. Everybody's a pundit about sports. Everybody's a pundit about comics.
Yeah.
The reason why the letters page started in comics. Comics are this wellspring. And this article came out today, or this survey, like that about how there's a lot of sexual harassment at science fiction conventions.
Oh, that's
And
not surprising, I have to admit.
yeah, it's not, no, of course it's not surprising at all. And there's a similar survey that was made of comics, but the numbers were much lower. I mean, they were
Hmm.
still way too high. And, as a young lass, when I was, in the fulsomeness of youth, like I went to a science fiction convention and I immediately decided it was full of creepy old men and I wouldn't go back.
Hmm.
I was done. I mean, it was so creepy. And comics, maybe there was a little bit of this and that here and there, but I felt, even with all the problems they had for women, I felt much more welcomed. And
Right.
certainly I was able to engage with comics creators in a way that was wonderful. For me personally, it was really great. And, I have friends I made way back in the day and we're still friends. And so, again, it's like, I guess I'm a comics defender. I mean, that's really what I am. I hope I'm not an apologist, but, um, comics were a lot better than science fiction in that way. And I mean, that doesn't mean comics are great. They certainly have a lot of ways to improve, but, um, there's just, people want to be, everyone can be involved in comics,
Hmm.
and everyone is involved with comics. That's why I'm saying journalism is valueless right now. And sports, it's the same thing. Every fan sits there and makes his or her voice known by booing or cheering or whatever. So it's like the value of each individual voice is lessened because of that. So,
Hmm.
and I mean, great sports writing is, um, there's no billionaires because of it.
Right. I mean, that is sports writing is actually, I think, in a golden age as well. But it is kind of funny how, I mean, not funny. It's very sad how difficult it is for a lot of amazing sports writers to survive. I mean, ESPN let go of so many like new writers and like writers
Mhm.
who've been around for forever. I mean, like Ed Werder, who covers football or NFL for them. I mean, that dude had been around since I was born. I mean,
Yeah,
like that guy's been writing about the NFL for longer than I've been alive, and it's
yeah,
just it's crazy to me. But I don't know. I mean, it is seen. I think a lot of this stuff. I mean, whether you're talking about the industry itself, or if you're talking about comics journalism and monetizing all that stuff and figuring out the way everything goes. I mean, I hate to use. I feel like it's almost like a cliched term at this point, but it's accurate. Is like we're all in this huge point of disruption, and it's like
right. We are.
things are everyone's kind of going through these awkward growing pains, and I don't know what it's going to look like when it comes out, but I,
It
I I think it'll all be there when it's done.
it will. And look at the pivot to video. I mean, quote, pivot to video,
I hate
unquote.
the pivot to
Ha
video.
ha ha. And guess what? People are pivoting to video and it's not making any difference. I mean, it's like if you go to Bleeding Cool or comicbook.com, to bring it back to us. It's like they all have these horrible auto start videos at the top of every story. And I'm sure they make some revenue from it. I'm sure it's a revenue stream for them. But it's not like they have huge video YouTube stars, It's like you speak the language that you're good at. And I'm good at writing. I've tried video. I mean, obviously, I like to talk. I like the sound of my own voice. So, podcasting is very easy for me.
Mm-hmm.
But video, I mean, sure. Am I a video native? I mean, one of the signs of ageism is when they want a digital native. Well, I consider myself a digital native because whenever there was, digital, I jumped right on it back in the dawn of time. Okay. So, am I a video native? No, I'm not. Even though I was doing cable TV back in the 80s. Okay. So
You were in the Image documentary, weren't you?
yes, I was, but I mean, I used to, back when they had cable access TV, I did a TV show, I mean, this is what the original YouTube. And so, I've done it for a long time. And but it's not what I'm the best at. It's not how I communicate with the world. And the YouTube stars who do it are great at it, I mean, these kids who are like, showing you how to put on your lip liner, they're naturals.
Yeah. You just gave me a horrible vision, though, of them remaking Wayne's World with Wayne and Garth being YouTube stars, and now I'm mortified.
Yeah, well, that's how it is. That's the same message, like the Taxi Driver's Book of Wisdom. Everybody goes a different way to see the same thing.
Heidi, I think that is a perfect place to end everything. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about comics and everything about comics, the state of comics. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course, David, anytime. It's always a pleasure. I'm sure in 2 years we'll be talking again. And God only knows what we'll be talking about it from our blasted bunkers, as we go out through radioactive fallout to buy our comics.
Oh, it's so exciting. I can't wait for the future.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with comics journalist Heidi MacDonald. You can find her on Twitter at @ComicsAce and on her site, The Beat, at comicsbeat.com. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Bobby Angus, Brian Klein Q, Darren Neely, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Michael Perlman, Phil Null, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Barry Straw, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Dan Lee, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfill, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corgan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Johan Borander, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Matt Battaglia, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter at @sketchcomic or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening and tune in next week for another episode.